In our previous unit, we looked at how the rising spirit of imperialism in America, coupled with victory over the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, elevated the United States to an empire status when it took control of territory in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and gained its strong influence in the nation of Cuba. In this lecture, we will look at post-war nationalism and how the spirit of imperialism and American success shaped our policies in the Far East, in places like the Philippines and China and Japan. We'll look in depth at the administrations of Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson in the pre-World War I era. Success against the Spanish led to a groundswell of patriotism and the notion that America's possibilities as a world leader were endless. Expansionists played up the possible trade and profits that could be made in places like the Philippines, and how cities there like Manila could become another major exporter to the East like Hong Kong. The Philippines had an abundance of natural resources, and the United States expansionists pushed the idea that it was our country's responsibility to uplift the people of the Philippines and to help them out of poverty. But not everybody felt this way. There's a growing network of Americans that opposed imperialistic ambitions. Specifically, members of the Democratic Party rallying behind growing Senate giant William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska feared many of these foreign issues would overshadow the much-needed reform that had begun back home. Some people feared the workers would never again see wage increases as they competed with low-wage earners in foreign countries. Others feared that American factories would be relocated overseas. The notion that in order to hold overseas colonies, that a country would need a large standing army meant that farmers' sons would be drawn into conflict in distant lands, and that an ever-increasing military budget would result in higher taxes. Other anti-imperialists feared the mongrelization of American culture. Even African-American groups were leery about imperialism, as they knew what consequences would befall the people in these foreign countries. The Anti-Imperialist League was officially formed to oppose William McKinley's re-election campaign and his policies on expansionism. This group included presidents of Stanford and Harvard universities, philosophers like William James, who had established the first school of psychology in the United States, and famous author Mark Twain. Labor leaders like Samuel Gompers and Andrew Carnegie also opposed American imperialism. Publicly, the Anti-Imperialist League criticized the McKinley administration for throwing off the yoke of one empire only to subjugate these people without their consent under the American flag. Clearly a violation of the Declaration of Independence and its promise to govern based upon the consent of the governed. Despite the ardent opposition of anti-imperialists, the Senate approved the Treaty of Paris with just one vote to spare on February 6, 1899, making the United States an official empire. With the conquest of the Philippines, America was a fully fledged empire. Although it would not compare in size and scope to the European powers, the United States did earn greater respect from its competitors in Europe. The Monroe Doctrine had been given a significant boost when Britain agreed to the settlement of territory in British Guyana. It also became an ardent ally of the United States as it became more concerned about its German neighbor. While the Philippines would open up a new market to the United States, it would also become its Achilles heel. Not only immediately following its annexation, but down the road during World War II, as Japan's empire built itself upon its own naval supremacy. When Filipinos like Emilio Aguinaldo realized that their support for the United States against Spain would not result in independence, bitterness and revolution developed once more. The United States deployed 126,000 troops to the Philippines to fight the natives who relied on guerrilla tactics, striking and then blending back into the jungle. Filipinos were now viewed not as an extended part of the American family, but as a dangerous enemy. Yellow journalists fed off the mayhem and the brutality that was reported from the front lines. The first use of the waterboarding torture is recorded during this time. In total, nearly 4,300 Americans and 57,000 Filipino soldiers were killed. That's a small number when compared to the 600,000 Filipinos that died as a result of this conflict. The insurrection finally broke in 1901 when Aguinaldo was captured. While he would be held prisoner for some time, he would actually later be released and live in the United States until his death in the 1980s. President McKinley appointed a Filipino commission to make the appropriate recommendations for the new government under U.S. rule. This would be led by future President William Howard Taft, who called the Filipinos his little brown brothers and would dance with Filipino women despite his 350-pound frame. The U.S. instituted educational, sanitation, public health, and infrastructure reforms, though the Filipinos remained resentful as a conquered people. The Philippines would remain a territory of the United States until July 4th, 1946, when independence came abruptly as a response to the conflict between the United States and Japan during World War II. While the Philippines provided new markets for American manufacturers, the real prize was access to China. Unlike Africa and the Middle East, China had not been claimed as a sphere of influence by any major European power, and the United States feared that if it didn't act quickly, Germany or another European country might take claim to it first. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay issued what became known as the Open Door Note to Japan and European powers, urging them to announce that they would respect certain Chinese rights and the idea of fair competition. In effect, any great power that was dealing with China as a trade partner had to respect the United States' right to access China as well. But the policy didn't gain international acceptance because it would be very difficult for the United States to back up its request. Furthermore, it caused a lot of frustration for the Chinese because Secretary Hay had never consulted them. A year later, a group of super patriotic Chinese nationalists rose up and executed over 200 foreigners and thousands of Chinese Christians as a way to send a signal to the West that it was not interested in being colonized. The destruction continued until a multinational rescue force made up of American, British, French, and Germans arrived and put the rebellion down. Several thousand American troops were dispatched from the Philippines to protect the United States' rights under the 1844 Treaty of Wanghia and to keep the open door policy propped open. The coalition ultimately penalized China with a $333 million fine. And while America played only a small role in the forces that quelled the rebellion, it received a disproportionate $24.5 million in indemnity. Since this was much more than was actually necessary, the United States sent back 18 million of that prize. China was so appreciative of the United States' honesty that it set the money aside as an education fund and used it to send a select group of Chinese students to the United States as a gesture of goodwill. These students would later play a significant role in opening and westernizing Southeast Asia. Secretary Hay released another set of notes in 1900. The open door policy would continue to embrace both economic trade, but also respect the territorial integrity of China. This was incorporated into the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, later violated when Japan took over Manchuria in 1931. Whether America's path forward into the 20th century would be defined by imperialism or isolationism was decided in the election of 1900. President McKinley was again nominated as the leader of the Republican Party. By his side was the charismatic former Vice Admiral of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. The two supported imperialism and championed their successes in the Spanish-American War. They also took along a conservative economic policy supporting the gold standard as a way to prosperity. Competing against McKinley was Nebraskan and populist William Jennings Bryan. A Silverite, Bryan wanted the issue of the day to continue to be the focus on progressive politics that would benefit the American working class. The election wasn't even close. McKinley triumphed by a wide margin, 292 electoral votes to Bryan's 155. Little did they know that McKinley would be murdered in September of 1901 by a deranged anarchist and Polish immigrant, Leon Klosgos. Teddy Roosevelt was inaugurated as president at the age of 42, making him the youngest president thus far. This wasn't the only milestone of Teddy Roosevelt's career. He also became the first president to play a significant role on the world stage. Imperialism in the Western Hemisphere was defined by his favorite mantra, walk softly, but carry a big stick, and you will go far. Military preparedness mandated a better access between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The Spanish-American War emphasized a need for a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The U.S. now had to protect Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, and the U.S. merchant marines across the globe. Originally, Americans favored a route across Nicaragua. A large portion of that route was already water. But when a French canal company dropped its price from $109 million to $40 million in the territory of Panama, Roosevelt couldn't help resist but considering the option. The last remaining hurdle to this objective was overcoming the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850. This had been a mutual agreement between the United States and Great Britain prohibiting any country from securing exclusive control over the isthmus. But as the relationship between Britain and the United States improved, and England's focus on affairs in South Africa grew more pressing, Britain was eager to support the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty of 1901. Britain not only gave the United States the right to build a canal, but a right to fortify it militarily as well. However, Panama was not an independent country. It was technically part of the nation of Colombia, and the Colombian Senate had rejected the treaty outright. Roosevelt responded to this issue with what became known as gunboat diplomacy. The French representative of the Canal Company, Felipe Bueno Varilla, worked with Panama revolutionaries to raise a tiny patriot army to fight for independence from Colombia. On November 3rd, 1903, the Panama Revolution took place. The U.S. Navy did not allow Colombian troops to cross the isthmus. On November 6th, 3 short days later, Roosevelt extended both diplomatic and political recognition to the new government of Panama. Buena Varilla, now Panama's prime minister, signed a treaty with Washington and agreed to build the Panama Canal for a cool $40 million. Roosevelt's responsibilities in this particular affair became quite controversial. Although the American public initially saw Roosevelt's role as politically legitimate, by 1911, Roosevelt would boast, "I took the canal," thus sparking a wave of controversy. Latin American countries grew weary of the Colossus of the North and referred to the Panamanian Revolution as the Rape of Panama. Roosevelt couldn't care less for the cooling emotions of Latin Americans towards the United States. Just as the wave of nationalism of the 1820s had led President Monroe to warn European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, this new nationalism led Roosevelt to declare that the United States had a legal right to exercise preventative intervention within Latin America when its interests were at stake. This big stick diplomacy, or what Latin Americans would refer to as bad neighbor policy, was put to the test in Latin American countries like Venezuela and the Dominican Republic. Roosevelt was concerned that the German and British empires would force their way back into the Western Hemisphere to collect debts from impoverished Latin American countries. In 1902, Germany sank 2 Venezuelan gunboats trying to seek a forced repayment for heavy Venezuelan debt. Britain also was owed by Venezuela. Roosevelt devised the policy of preventative intervention, now known as the Roosevelt Corollary. This extension of the Monroe Doctrine declared that in future financial crises concerning Latin American debt, the United States would intervene, take over custom houses, pay off the debt to Latin American nations, and keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. He justified it on the grounds that the United States had a moral obligation because it would not allow European nations themselves to intervene in bankrupt banana republics. Thus, the United States became the policeman of the Caribbean. Contrasted with the Monroe Doctrine that had merely told Europeans to stay out, Roosevelt's policies was a radical departure, but its association with the Monroe Doctrine helped it to gain public acceptance. It was eventually used to justify wholesale interventions and repeated landings by the U.S. Marines in countries such as the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti. In 1905, a Dominican treaty gave the United States supervisory powers over the Dominican tariff collections. In effect, the Dominican Republic became a U.S. protectorate. And again in 1906, the United States sent a contingent of Marines to Cuba as a response to civil unrest there by people who were protesting the high tariffs against Cuban sugar. Roosevelt sent in the Marines, who remained there until 1909. While they would be removed, U.S. troops would reoccupy Cuba in 1917 during World War I and remain there until 1922. Roosevelt wasn't only a leader in Western Hemisphere politics, but also became a world leader as well. In 1904, Russia and Japan went to war. They had been fighting over the territory in northern China known as Manchuria. As war dragged on, Japan started running short of men and money. Roosevelt was eager to prevent either side from gaining a monopoly in Asia, but did not want to seek war with either party. Concerned about the safety of his newly acquired Philippines and responding to a request by Japan to secretly sponsor peace negotiations, Roosevelt put together a peace meeting in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905. Japan had been demanding huge payments as well as strategic access to the Skulkin Islands. Russia refused to concede defeat. Roosevelt's hammered out agreement was that Japan would gain the southern half of the Skulkin Islands, control over the Korean peninsula, but no indemnity payment. For his work, Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize of 1906, but he also received something else that he didn't intend. The United States' relationship with two fledgling empires soured. The Russians felt that they had been robbed of their victory, and U.S. opinion of Russia had been changing anyway, as reports of savage massacres of Russian Jews furthered the position that Russia was a tyrannical country. Japan also felt cheated out of its due compensation. Both newly powerful nations, Japan and America, went from being allies to rivals in the Pacific theater. This relationship was further soured when, in 1906, 70,000 Japanese immigrants poured into California. Americans were shocked. They had just faced a catastrophic earthquake, and now they seemed to face a threat to their racial purity. Californians formed the influential Asian Exclusion League, and the San Francisco School Board officially ruled that Asian children must be educated separately from white students. People of Japan were furious over the news of this discrimination. Irresponsible talks of war sizzled in the yellow press. Roosevelt was concerned enough about the California issue, starting a war, that he invited the entire San Francisco School Board of Education to the White House. In what became known as the Gentleman's Agreement, Japan agreed to no longer send refugees to the United States. In exchange, Californians agreed not to segregate Japanese students from public schools. Fearing Japanese perception that the United States was weak, Roosevelt took what he dubbed his most important contribution to world peace. 6 battleships, painted white, dubbed the Great White Fleet, departed Virginia in 1907. This world tour would take the Great Fleet through the Caribbean, across the Panama Canal, and into the East. The high point of the trip would be a visit to Japan's harbors, where tens of thousands of school children waved tiny American flags and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. A peace agreement between the two countries was settled. The Root-Takahara Agreement of 1908 pledged both powers would respect one another's territorial possessions in the Pacific. The open-door policy to China would continue. For the moment, two powers found a meaningful peace. Roosevelt's preference for military intervention and big stick diplomacy evolved under the administration of President William Howard Taft. Rather than the use of weapons, Taft depended on the use of dollar signs. Using a foreign policy to protect Wall Street, Taft invested American dollars in Latin America. He sought to reduce rival powers like Germany and Britain from taking advantage of the financial chaos in the Caribbean by promoting U.S. bankers who would strengthen U.S. defense and foreign policies by making Latin American countries dependent on loans from the United States. Thus, dollar diplomacy meant that companies like U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, the American Telegraph and Telephone Service, and U.S. Rubber would have a monopoly in Latin American interests. Though certainly more peaceful, dollar diplomacy did have its shortcomings. For example, in 1909, President Taft saw the Manchurian Railroad monopoly by Russia and Japan as a threat to the U.S. open-door policy. He proposed that a group of U.S. and foreign bankers buy the railroad and turn them over to China. However, Japan and Russia refused to give up the important railroad, and Taft ended up looking ridiculous. Furthermore, several countries that had been propped up by US money still required military intervention later on, most notably Honduras and Haiti. As the 20th century entered its second decade, American imperialistic ambition was softened by its shortcomings. Democrat Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated into office in 1913. Wilson was an avowed anti-imperialist. He hated the notion that countries would not have self-determination. He was further suspicious of Wall Street and big money's investments in Latin American countries dictating American foreign policy. While Wilson was an anti-imperialist, he would also ultimately be forced to invade more Latin American countries than any other president in US history. Haiti's chaotic political situation would eventually cause Wilson to send in the Marines once again. Political turmoil climaxed in 1914 when an outraged group of Haitians literally tore the leader of their country into pieces. Despite his abhorrence for dollar diplomacy, Wilson would agree to a treaty with the Haitians in 1916, putting them at protectorate status and agreeing to supervise and help with the repayment of their financial debt. He would also purchase the Virgin Islands from the country of Denmark. Uncle Sam tightened its grip in the Caribbean with its vital approach to the Panama Canal. But perhaps Wilson's biggest hurdle in avoiding international conflict and reducing America's imperialistic ambition was the Mexican Revolution of 1913. At the turn of the 20th century, Mexico had been in a state of civil war. In 1913, a new revolutionary president had been murdered and replaced by Generalissimo Victoriano Huerta. This coup caused a massive migration of Mexicans to the United States. More than 1 million Spanish-speaking newcomers came and settled in the Southwest. The bloodshed, chaos, and damage to American property was once again front-page news in the yellow press. But President Wilson refused to practice diplomacy the way his predecessors had done. Wilson tried to steer a moral cause for Mexico. And in 1914, he allowed American arms to be sold to Huerta's principal rivals, General Venustiano Carranza and rebel Francisco Pancho Villa. In what's known as the Tampico Incident, a small party of American sailors were arrested by the Huerta regime. Mexicans released the captives and apologized for the accident, but refused demands by the United States as it departed the Tampico shores for a 21-gun salute. Determined to remove Huerta from office, Wilson asked Congress for authority to use force against Mexico. But before Congress could act, Wilson had a Navy seaport at Veracruz on the Baja California blocked to avoid the arrival of German weapons sent to reinforce Huerta's men. Furthermore, war was spared between the US and Mexico when the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, offered to mediate the conflict. Huerta eventually was removed from office in July of 1914 and was succeeded by his arch-rival Carranza. Frustrated with being passed over in favor of Carranza, Villa continued to initiate conflict between the United States and Mexico, killing 16 American miners traveling on a railroad in northern Mexico. A month later, Villa and his followers crossed the border into Columbus, New Mexico, and slaughtered 19 Americans. Future leader of America's World War I efforts, General John Blackjack Pershing was ordered to break up this bandits' operations. He sent a force of several thousand mounted troops deep into Mexico, but was met there by the Mexican army. While Pancho Villa's forces were defeated and scattered, he missed the chance to capture Villa himself. A real resolution between the United States and Mexico was suspended as tensions with Germany mounted. Wilson withdrew Pershing from Mexico in January 1917.